Konnichiwa, colleagues. My presentation is about Japanese women learning English in the United States, and it's entitled Gender and L1 Politeness Strategies and Their Effect on L2 Pragmatic Performance. So we all know, right, that Japanese is a complex language and it's full of rules about honor and etiquette, and Japanese women's subordination is reflected in their language, and this inevitably has an effect on L2 acquisition. So that's sort of true, right? It's about as realistic and as accurate as the traditional young lady in the picture over there. But Japanese is a complex language, that much is true. So written Japanese uses a syllabary with three writing systems, which are known as kana. Hiragana, which is phonographic, katakana, also phonographic, and kanji, which is morphographic. And there's more about that in our textbook on page 601. And in modern practice, all three systems, as well as the Western alphabet Romaji, are used even within the same sentence. And technically, Japanese uses mora rather than syllables, and each mora is of the same length and stress. And a key phonotactic constraint in Japanese is an avoidance of consonant clusters, and there's more in our textbook on page 104 about that. And it results in the insertion of vowels when English words are borrowed. For example, taxi becomes takushi. In modern Japanese, they use all three script systems. However, it used to be that hiragana was historically a female script as a more simple form, and kanji was the complicated one that men would use. Katakana is used for foreign introduced words. These days, hiragana is a child's first written script, and then they graduate on up to kanji, the adult syllabary. So the writing system isn't really the topic of this paper, but I thought its complexity would serve as fair warning about the linguistic issues that are faced by Japanese English language learners and their ESL instructors. Some things, however, are simpler in Japanese, and these also have an effect sometimes on English language learning. Nouns, for example, don't use number or gender, so you might see some errors there. It's simpler when you're learning Japanese. You don't have to worry so much about subject-verb agreement, but that might be a cause of confusion for your English language learner. Tense is also simpler if you are learning Japanese. It's handled through just past and present, which again is going to cause some complications for your English language learner. There are no articles or prepositions as such, although Japanese does have demonstratives such as sono, and particles or postpositions rather than prepositions such as wa and ga, which are pretty darn tricky to learn, just as prepositions are for ELLs. Technically, Japanese also doesn't use pronouns, but there are words that serve similar functions, such as I, which is a personal referent, and it's often translated as pronouns. Watashi is what women would use, and boku is what men might use. Even though they are not technically gendered, they're the speaking forms. Also, Japanese subjects always end with the verb. Subjects, however, are often implied in Japanese sentences, so sentences might appear to be an OV pattern. So our second sort of stereotype that I was mentioning at the beginning, Japanese is concerned with honor and etiquette. That is also true in a complicated manner. A system called keigo incorporates formality levels, honorifics and gendered speech forms into the Japanese language, and usage varies according to the speaker's and speaker-hearer status and insider-outsider status, also known as uchi and non-uchi. So if you are inside the group, you might treat yourselves as communal speakers in that sense and assign a group status to yourself. There are also formality levels. So there's plain speech, which you might use among friends and equals, polite speech, and also highly formal speech. These involve different verb forms of the same word. Polite speech is often seen as female. Given that polite speech is what most Japanese language learners are taught, some male Americans or English speakers are surprised to learn that they are speaking a female form of Japanese when they go abroad. Honorifics are also involved. We're probably fairly familiar with those, such as adding san to the end, or titles such as sensei. Okay. But there are also male and female speech patterns. There's Otoko Kobata, which is the male speech pattern, and Ona Kobota, which is the female one, and they're primarily distinguished by the level of honorific use, politeness forms, and indirectness, although there are also vocabulary choices that would be used. Matsumoto states that these aspects of Japanese force listeners to choose a specific register or form of speech. So the combination of keigo and Japanese gender roles means that Japanese English language learners can face difficulties in the TESOL classroom. Conlon explores why Japanese ESL speakers, whose performance in the second language might well be grammatically adequate and semantically unambiguous, are frequently perceived in quite negative terms by their native-speaking interlocutors. And he argues that Brown and Levinson's face-threatening acts theory, as well as other aspects of linguistic politeness, is part of the answer here. Conlon especially focuses on how face-threatening act theory applies in the Japanese family, and there's a strong focus on hierarchy and insider-outsider, the uchi, non-uchi that I mentioned before, and that it permeates Japanese society. Matsumoto also observes that a Japanese must generally understand where she or he stands in relation to other members of the group or society and acknowledge their dependence on the others. And she argues that that really complicates some of the idea of negative face wants and puts a twist on face-threatening act theory. So, combined with other Japanese linguistic habits, such as seeming to agree when really one is simply listening or acknowledging, the different cultural FTA strategies, keigo, and Japanese gender roles, this can really cause particular challenges for Japanese English language learners. Things are changing, though. That traditional picture is really no longer accurate. Younger Japanese women are adapting aspects of Otoko Kobata, male speech, such as using boku instead of watashi. That's the personal referent equivalent to I, remember, that's used instead of pronouns. Ide also referred to her own 1980 study that concluded that women's use of more polite language was not really due to their subordinate position in society. Instead, it was because most female subjects were housewives whose roles primarily involved social interaction, and therefore they used the polite form more. So they're tied together, but it's not necessarily a direct cause and effect. Ide predicted correctly that as women began to work outside the home and assume roles in the workplace, their use of language changed and became more diversified. Women have started to pick up variety associated with men's repertoire in the workplace, and although they still do use more polite forms as an index of femaleness in the social interaction. So we need to think a little bit about how a female JEL in our classrooms would maybe need to be accommodated, or to have her language patterns understood, that she may seem more deferential, but that's not necessarily true at all. It may just be the linguistic patterns. Okay? But there may be seeming agreement where perhaps there is still some misunderstanding. Thank you for listening. There's a whole lot more in my paper, but with the limited time available, I could only squish in some of the really interesting stuff that I had found. Here's some references for you. Thank you. Bye-bye.